All right, let's dive in. Today, we're tackling the Silk Road,
Yeah, this incredible network of trade routes,
spanning continents, connecting east and west for centuries.
really shaping history.
We've got a lot to unpack today. Historical accounts, modern comparisons.
We even have an activity where we kind of step into the shoes of a Silk Road trader.
Should be a fun one. So for starters, where did this Silk Road actually go?
Okay, so picture this. You've got a line stretching from the eastern Mediterranean
Bustling ports, right?
all the way across Central Asia
Wow.
and eventually reaching China.
That's a huge distance. And it wasn't just one road, was it?
No, not at all. It was a whole network of paths over land and sea.
Connecting all sorts of places along the way.
Exactly. Think about maritime routes woven into the mix. Goods going from Central Asia to Japan, Java,
By sea.
and then others sailing across the Mediterranean to Rome.
It really shows how connected the world was, even back then. But here's something I find interesting. The goods themselves often traveled farther than the people trading them, didn't they?
Oh, for sure. You didn't have merchants trekking all the way from China to Rome.
More like a relay race.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Each trader taking goods for a segment of the journey, selling them to another trader who would then carry them further.
Almost like a global supply chain way before its time.
With camels and ships instead of cargo planes, and each step of the way, the price would go up, generating profit for each trader.
That reminds me of that t-shirt example we had. The journey those things make is wild, starting as raw materials in, say, Brazil or Texas,
Then transformed into cloth in China,
sewn together in Haiti,
printed in Washington.
finally ending up with someone in, let's say, Indiana.
Right. And then, who knows, maybe donated and shipped off again.
Cameroon. Honduras. Even back to Haiti.
It's incredible.
Talking about all these goods, we can't forget about silk itself.
Right, the very heart of the Silk Road.
Still luxurious, even today.
And for a long time, the Chinese protected the secrets of how to make it fiercely.
It was their treasure.
Their golden goose.
But it's important to remember, it wasn't the only thing traded.
Oh no, not at all. Think olives and wine from the Mediterranean. Jade and silver from China.
Patina textiles from India, right?
Absolutely. Ivory from East Africa. Spices and tortoiseshells from Arabia.
It was a global marketplace centuries before globalization as we know it.
Exactly. It wasn't just about what you needed, but about luxury and exotic things. Spices and rare materials shaping tastes and driving economies across continents.
But it's interesting, you'd think the Romans, with all their extravagance, would have embraced silk fully, but their Senate actually tried to ban it. Multiple times.
It's true. Seneca the Younger even called it immodest.
Seneca the Younger.
The Roman philosopher and statesman.
Yeah.
He said it barely covered anything. Even suggested husbands wearing silk couldn't be sure they were seeing their wives or someone else.
Wow. What was behind this aversion to silk, though? Was it morality or something more practical?
Well, beneath that moral outrage, there was a real economic worry.
Ah, I see.
Silk was so popular that it was creating a trade imbalance. Romans paying for this luxury import, draining their coffers. Sound familiar?
Oh, absolutely. Even today, governments grapple with trade imbalances, trying to protect their own industries.
Exactly. It seems some things never change.
But then, like now, wealth often wins over politics.
Right. The Roman elite just couldn't resist silk. The ban failed.
It's this constant tension between economic forces and political control, something we still see today.
Absolutely. Whether it's debates about free trade or the influence of big corporations on government.
Like those huge donations to political campaigns.
Or even, as that crash course video suggested, Putin jailing billionaires who disagree with him.
Wow, it's fascinating how these historical patterns repeat themselves. But let's get back to the Silk Road itself. With all this trade flourishing, certain groups really rose to prominence. No one more so than the nomads of Central Asia.
Oh, totally. The Silk Road really brought them into the spotlight. Their mobility, their knowledge of the land.
And their herding lifestyle, right?
It all made them perfect for trading in this vast, challenging environment.
They were the ultimate couriers of their time, navigating mountains, deserts, even sea routes.
Exactly. Take the Yuezhi, for example. After they were crushed by the Yuongnu.
Wait, the Xiongnu, weren't those the guys known for making drinking cups out of their enemies' skulls?
Gruesome, right? But that defeat forced the Yuezhi to migrate, and they ended up founding the Kushan Empire, a major player on the Silk Road.
So this one event, a clash between nomadic groups, reshaped the Silk Road.
And as new powers like this emerged, cities along the Silk Road flourished, became these bustling centers of commerce and culture.
Like Palmyra, which controlled the flow of incense and silk into Rome. Imagine the sights and sounds of these cities.
Caravans arriving with exotic goods, merchants haggling in all sorts of languages.
The air filled with spices.
But these cities weren't just about trade. They were vital stopping points.
For the travelers, right?
Caravans needed to rest their animals, stock up on supplies.
And, well, let's just say certain services were in high demand, even back then.
It adds a bit of spice to the story.
It's important to remember, though, the Silk Road was more than just commerce. It was a path for ideas, religions, cultural practices, a real exchange of knowledge.
Exactly. And that brings us to the spread of Buddhism. It traveled east along these very routes.
Carried by monks, pilgrims, merchants.
And as it interacted with different cultures, it evolved into Mahayana Buddhism.
So what sets that apart? What are the key differences?
Well, in Mahayana Buddhism, Buddha himself is seen as divine, unlike earlier traditions where he was more of a wise teacher.
Interesting.
And nirvana takes on a different meaning.
Oh, so.
It becomes more like a heavenly realm instead of just liberation from suffering.
It seems like the idea of nirvana changed to resonate with the cultures it met along the way.
Precisely. And then you have the bodhisattvas, these enlightened beings who delay their own liberation to help others.
Selfless, huh?
They become central to Mahayana Buddhism, embodying compassion.
It's amazing how a religion can transform as it spreads, like a chameleon adapting to its environment. And speaking of adapting, those Buddhist monasteries along the Silk Road weren't just spiritual centers.
True. They were also really convenient stops for caravans. Merchants wanted what you might call supernatural insurance, so they'd donate generously.
In return, the monasteries would offer lodging, supplies, maybe even some spiritual guidance.
It was a win-win. But the Silk Road had a darker side, too, a consequence of connecting people from such different places.
Like what?
Well, it wasn't always about peaceful exchange. The Silk Road also became a pathway for disease, measles, smallpox.
They traveled these routes too,
wreaking havoc on populations that had no immunity.
And of course, the most infamous traveler of all, the bubonic plague.
The Black Death, which hit Europe in the 14th century, was devastating. Almost half of Europe's population died in just a few years.
Imagine entire cities decimated, economies crippled, fear and uncertainty everywhere.
It's a reminder that even with progress, there can be unintended consequences. Just like the Silk Road, globalization today brings opportunities and risks. The promise of prosperity and connection, but also the potential for widespread disaster. It offers valuable lessons as we face the challenges and opportunities of our own interconnected world. But before we jump into that, why don't we step back in time and experience the Silk Road firsthand, at least in our minds?
All right. Let's imagine we're merchants in ancient China, ready to head west.
What are we packing to make sure this journey is a success?
That's a question that needs some serious thinking.
We'll explore those choices and the challenges ahead in our next segment.
Okay, so we're picturing ourselves as these Silk Road traders setting off from China, caravan loaded up. What are we taking to make sure this trip is a success?
Well, you got to think about what people further west really want. What's going to sell well in those markets? Silk's a no-brainer, of course.
Yeah, it's light, durable, and it just screams luxury.
Exactly. But it's also going to cost you a lot to get. And any smart trader knows, don't put all your eggs in one basket. You got to diversify.
Right. Spread the risk. So what else are we packing?
Porcelain's a good bet. People loved it for its beauty and how well it was made. Then there's tea.
Ah, tea. With its unique flavors and ability to wake you up.
Exactly. And let's not forget about spices.
Oh, yeah. Everyone wanted those exotic flavors and smells, especially in the West.
Cinnamon, cloves, peppercorns. Imagine them hitting the markets in Persia and Rome.
I can practically smell them. But hold on. Our journey isn't just about what we start with, is it? It's about being smart and grabbing opportunities along the way.
You got it. As you head west, you're going to need traders from all over. Persia, India, the Roman Empire. Every encounter is a chance to make a deal. Get new goods. Maybe change your plan based on what the market's doing.
So it's like a giant game of strategy played out in real life. Every decision, every trade could make or break your trip.
And don't underestimate the value of information. Talk to other traders. Find out what's hot, what's not. Even gossip and rumors can give you an edge in this competitive world.
Sounds more than just trading trip. It's an adventure, a test of your smarts and your resilience. Big risks, even bigger rewards. But amidst all the profits and planning, let's not forget, the Silk Road could be dangerous.
Oh, definitely. Bandits were always a threat. lurking around, ready to pounce on caravans with valuable stuff.
Yikes.
And even if you dodged those guys, you still had treacherous mountains, scorching deserts, and unpredictable weather, all slowing you down and eating into your profits.
And what about those caravanserais, those roadside inns? I bet they weren't always as safe as they were supposed to be.
Sure, they were a place to rest, restock, and share stories. But they could also be hubs for shady deals and rumors. Imagine it. Dark corners, whispers of stolen goods and rival groups, maybe even a good old-fashioned brawl over a bad trade.
Makes you realize the Silk Road was more than just a road. It was like a mini-world, a blend of commerce, adventure, danger, and cultural exchange.
All these connections, with their ups and downs, remind me of something happening today, China's Belt and Road Initiative.
Yes. The modern Silk Road, a huge network of infrastructure projects spanning continents, trying to reshape global trade for the 21st century. Pretty ambitious, wouldn't you say?
It's massive. Over 2,600 projects in over 100 countries. We're talking ports, railways, pipelines, highways, whole economic corridors. It's got the potential to change everything.
It's definitely making waves, but what's the driving force behind it? Is it just about economics and connecting the world with infrastructure, or is there something more?
Officially, the Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI, is about boosting trade, helping economies grow, and bringing China closer to the rest of the world. But some people think it's also China's way of showing its power, trying to change global politics to benefit them.
So it's not just roads and bridges, it's about relationships and power. How is this different from how the West usually handles development?
That's a great question. China's approach is very different. The West usually attaches conditions to their aid. Things like pushing for democratic reforms, good governance, transparency, that kind of stuff.
So China's offering a different deal, more like a partnership without those strings attached.
Right. It's a tempting offer for countries that want to modernize and boost their economies.
Yeah.
But is it all it's cracked up to be?
That's the big question, isn't it? It could help a lot of people and increase global trade. But there are definitely worries about the long-term consequences.
For sure.
Things like debt traps, lack of transparency, and potential damage to the environment, right?
Yeah.
Like what we saw in that Al Jazeera video.
Exactly. Critics say China's using the BRI to get developing countries stuck in debt they can't handle,
Giving them control over valuable assets and resources.
They point to examples like Sri Lanka.
Where China got a 99-year lease on a major port because Sri Lanka couldn't pay back the loans for building it.
Right. And then there's Djibouti, where a huge chunk of their GDP is now owed to China.
It's easy to see how that could create a power imbalance.
China insists these are win-win partnerships, but the secrecy around a lot of BRI deals raises red flags.
So it's a gamble for these countries. The potential for growth, but also the risk of becoming too dependent on one powerful partner.
And the stakes are huge, not just for the countries involved, but for the whole world. The BRI is changing the global landscape, and its impact will last for a long time.
So how has the West responded to all this? Are they just watching as China's influence grows?
Not exactly. To counter China, the G7 nations launched their own initiative, Build Back Better World.
B3W for short.
Right.
So it's like a global infrastructure showdown.
Oh.
West versus China, using development projects to compete for influence. Sounds like something out of the Cold War.
There are definitely some similarities. B3W focuses on transparency, good governance, and protecting the environment.
All things they see as lacking in China's approach.
Exactly.
So is this a winner-take-all situation, or is there room for everyone to work together for a better future?
That's the key question. Is China's rise a threat or an opportunity?
Big questions with no easy answers. We'll see how things play out as the BRI progresses and its impact becomes clearer. But for now, let's get back to that ancient Silk Road and our trading adventure.
We've packed our caravan, weighed the risks, and learned about the challenges of Silk Road commerce. Now it's time for the journey itself. Okay, so here we are. Our caravan's all packed up. Silk, porcelain, tea, spices.
Ready for the long haul west.
Can you picture it? Camels loaded down, merchants battling the desert wind.
Wagon wheels creaking through those mountain passes.
It's quite an image, huh? But like we've been talking about, the Silk Road wasn't a walk in the park. What were some of the real-world challenges those traders had to face?
Yeah, those guys were tough.
Imagine those landscapes. Scorching deserts, treacherous mountains, windswept plains.
And just getting around must have been a nightmare.
Right. Keeping those animals fed and watered, making sure your goods didn't get stolen or damaged.
Not to mention the constant wear and tear on the wagon.
Yeah.
And no GPS or paved roads back then.
Or Amazon Prime delivery.
Exactly. And let's not forget about the human side of things.
Yeah.
These journeys could take months, even years.
Wow.
You're traveling with a whole group of people, all with their own personalities and reasons for being there.
Probably some hidden agendas.
Keeping everyone happy, dealing with arguments, making sure they all work together.
That would have been key to succeeding.
Absolutely.
No.
And then there's the constant worry about bandits, always lurking, ready to attack,
You'd always have to be on your guard.
protecting your goods, your life. And even if you avoided those guys, you still had political turmoil, border disputes, alliances changing all the time.
Yikes.
The Silk Road went through so many different kingdoms and empires, each with their own laws and customs.
That must have been a headache just trying to figure all that out.
You had to know how to handle it, how
Yeah.
to negotiate, how to stay on the right side of powerful rulers, all for safe passage.
It's incredible that they not only managed to move all those goods, but they were like cultural ambassadors too.
Right, spreading ideas and religions and artistic styles.
Over huge distances.
In a way, they were like the influencers of their time, connecting different cultures, shaping history with their travels.
Think about those Buddhist monks spreading their teachings, building monasteries in faraway lands.
Or the scientific knowledge, the math, the astronomy that traveled along those routes.
The Silk Road wasn't just about trading stuff. It was about sharing knowledge, this human curiosity, the urge to connect with the rest of the world.
It really shows what humans can achieve when they set their minds to it. It makes you wonder, what can we learn from all this?
Yeah, as we're dealing with globalization today, with all its complexities,
The interconnected economies, technology changing everything, cultures blending.
are we on a similar path, facing new challenges as we try to connect the world?
And more importantly, can we avoid repeating the mistakes of the past
Those unintended consequences of those early trade routes,
to build a better future for everyone?
these are questions we need to think about.
They force us to really examine the world we're creating, the legacy we'll leave behind.
Well, this has been quite a journey, exploring the Silk Road through all these amazing sources.
From how silk is made to the spread of Buddhism.
From the dangers those ancient traders faced to the global impact of modern initiatives like the Belt and Road.
I hope our listeners have a new appreciation for this ancient network, a network that still affects us today.
And maybe you're even feeling inspired to learn more.
To dig deeper into the history and the lasting influence of the Silk Road.
So until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep making those connections.
There's a whole world out there waiting to be discovered.
And who knows, maybe we'll run into each other again on one of those virtual trade routes, sharing stories as we explore the world of knowledge together. Thanks for joining us.
All right, let's dive deep into the Silk Road. But not just the camels and caravans you might already know about. We're going deeper,
Way deeper.
using YouTube videos, a really detailed PDF, and even stuff from the UNESCO Silk Road's website. We want to uncover the real impact of this ancient network.
Yeah, it's easy to picture like flowing silk and stuff, but what's really interesting is all the other goods that traveled alongside it. Like imagine tortoise shells just bumping around next to bolts of fine cotton in these caravans, like mundane stuff and luxury all together.
That's such a vivid image. It really shows just how diverse the Silk Road was.
Yeah.
You know, it wasn't just silk. There were spices, jade, ivory, even animals. Kind of reminds you of global trade today, doesn't it? Just swap out camels for cargo ships. But does this ancient network only benefit the elites? Or did regular people feel its effects too?
The Silk Road's impact trickled down in some pretty surprising ways. Economically, you had whole communities shifting to meet the demand. Think silk weavers, farmers growing specific crops for trade. Imagine entire towns specializing in goods for markets like miles away.
Yeah, it's like those global supply chains we have today, just on a smaller scale, before the Industrial Revolution. But it wasn't just economics, right? You mentioned the spread of ideas earlier. Were things like philosophies and religions traded like commodities?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Think about how Buddhism traveled from India. As it moved, it changed and evolved into Mahayana Buddhism, blending with all the cultures along their way. The Silk Road was more than just a trade route. It was like a path for cultural exchange.
For better or for worse, huh? For worse, what do you mean?
Well, along with all these fascinating exchanges, the interconnectedness also helped spread some bad things, like diseases. For instance, the bubonic plague traveled along those same routes, with really bad consequences, the Black Death.
Yeah, definitely.
Nearly half of Europe died because of it. It's a reminder that global interconnectedness, it can have downsides too.
Yeah, that's for sure. It really does paint a complex picture. Economic opportunities, cultural mixing, but also potential for widespread disease. It's kind of like how we're anxious about globalization today, isn't it? And speaking of the modern world, doesn't China's Belt and Road Initiative remind you of the Silk Road?
It definitely does. It's fascinating how China's using its past to shape its future. On a global scale, too. I mean, think about it. This initiative, with all these land and sea routes connecting China to Asia, Africa, Europe, it has a similar ambition to the Silk Road, just with, updated technology and higher stakes.
Hold on, higher stakes. Are we just talking about bigger trade deals? Or is there something like deeper going on geopolitically?
You've hit the nail on the head.
Okay.
Economics are definitely a big factor, but a lot of people see this initiative as a way for China to gain more influence globally. Building these routes lets them strengthen ties with other countries, both economically and politically.
So it's not just goods and money moving around, but power and influence too. To really understand the scale of this, maybe we should look at specific cities, places that thrived along the Silk Road.
Absolutely, let's do that. Our sources highlight a few that really stand out, like Samarkand. It's in modern-day Uzbekistan. It was known for its bustling bazaars. Imagine you're surrounded by merchants from all over the world. They're bartering for spices, silks. You hear all these different languages.
Wow, it's quite a scene. It's more than just a marketplace. It's like a sensory overload of global trade. What other Silk Road hubs should we check out?
Well, Baghdad during the Islamic Golden Age is another great one. It was home to the House of Wisdom. It was the center of learning. Ancient Greek texts were translated and preserved there, which had a huge influence on Islamic scholarship and the development of science and philosophy.
So it wasn't just knowledge flowing from west to east. The House of Wisdom shows it went both ways.
Exactly. It was a two-way street. And of course, we can't talk about the Silk Road without mentioning Constantinople. It was the gateway between East and West. Today, it's Istanbul, in Turkey. But back then, it was like this melting pot of cultures, where all the riches of the Silk Road flowed into the Roman Empire.
I can just picture those ships, loaded with goods from the east, arriving at the port. Constantinople must have been an incredible crossroads of civilizations. But it wasn't just goods being traded, right? What about technology? Did any significant technologies get exchanged along the way?
Oh, absolutely. Take the stirrup, for example. Seems like a simple invention, right? It originated in the East and traveled west. And it completely revolutionized warfare, gave mounted warriors so much more stability and power.
It's wild to think about the impact of something as simple as a stirrup. Like, it's almost as important as the invention of gunpowder in terms of warfare. What other technological innovations traveled the Silk Road?
Well, think about paper and printing. Those came from China and went west, too, and eventually led to this huge change in how information was shared in Europe.
It's like the ancient version of the internet. And speaking of things that changed history, we can't forget about the Mongols, can we? They seem to have played a pretty big role in the Silk Road story.
They did. It's ironic, actually. The Mongols, often seen as destructive conquerors, they actually kind of revitalized the Silk Road during their rule.
Okay, I'm all ears. How did a group known for conquering end up boosting trade along the Silk Road?
It's a classic case of unintended consequences. As the Mongols were conquering these huge parts of Eurasia, they established Pax Mongolica, which was this period of, relative peace and stability, and that actually helped trade flourish along the Silk Road.
So having a unified Eurasia, even under Mongol rule, allowed trade to flourish. That's not what you usually think of when you hear about conquerors. But the Silk Road wasn't just about conquest and commerce, was it? Did we talk about cultural blending earlier?
Yeah, and it goes way beyond just Buddhism spreading. Imagine a Silk Road city filled with Buddhist monks from China, Roman merchants, Persian traders. They're all interacting and sharing ideas, art, religion, languages, all mixing together. It was a vibrant mix of cultures.
Yeah, that's the image everyone has of the Silk Road, this cultural melting pot where East meets West. But can you give me a more concrete example of this cultural blending? How did it actually show up?
We'll look at Mahayana Buddhism again. It's this amazing blend of Eastern and Western influences, a direct result of this fusion of cultures. Or look at the art from the time. You often see this blending of styles in Silk Road artifacts. It shows how different cultures were meeting and merging.
So it's like this ancient network was a giant cultural blender, mixing together all these influences from around the world, creating something totally new. It's amazing to think how interconnected the world already was back then.
It really is, and there's still so much more to uncover about this fascinating time period.
You're right, we've only just started to scratch the surface of the Silk Road. Let's dig even deeper when we come back.
Welcome back to our deep dive on the Silk Road. We've talked about the goods, the cultural exchange, but what about the actual mechanics of trade? How did people actually do business across this vast network?
Yeah, that's a good question. Was it all bartering, or did they have some kind of, I don't know, ancient currency exchange going on?
Well, it was kind of a cool mix of both. For smaller transactions, yeah, bartering was definitely the norm. Imagine traders haggling, trading silks for spices, trying to get the best deal.
That's like straight out of a movie.
Yeah.
But for bigger deals, I mean, especially for merchants traveling across continents,
Yeah.
they must have needed something a bit more standardized, right?
Exactly. For those big transactions, different forms of currency popped up along the Silk Road, coins, minted by different empires and kingdoms. Those became really important for making trade run smoothly.
This is kind of like our modern currencies.
Yeah.
Just on a smaller, more regional scale.
Exactly. And just like today, those currencies went up and down in value, based on things like supply and demand, political stability. Even just rumors of a war or famine could send the markets into a frenzy.
Sounds like a pretty risky business. You've got bandits, unpredictable weather, currencies fluctuating all over the place. What made it all worthwhile for these Silk Road merchants? Was it just the chance of getting rich?
Well, profits definitely played a big role, but there's also evidence that a lot of merchants were driven by something more, like a sense of adventure, a desire to see the world and experience new cultures.
So it wasn't just a job then, it was a lifestyle. I can almost imagine the feeling of setting off with a caravan, not knowing what you might find on the other side of the desert.
Speaking of caravans, what were those journeys actually like?
Okay, picture this. You're a merchant in Constantinople. You've got all these goods that you're taking to the markets in China. You join a caravan, this long line of camels, loaded down with silks, spices, all sorts of treasures, and you're winding your way across deserts and mountains. That sounds intense. These journeys must have taken months, even years. Not to mention how dangerous they were. Bandits, harsh weather, wild animals. It's like something out of an adventure novel.
It definitely was, and the dangers were very real. Some caravans hired guards for protection. Others relied on just having a lot of people to deter attackers.
I bet those travelers had some stories to tell. Narrow escapes, encounters with strange creatures, rumors of lost cities filled with treasure.
Exactly. Those journeys were full of hardship, but they were also filled with these incredible tales and experiences.
But it couldn't have been all danger and excitement, right? I mean, these caravans must have needed places to stop and get supplies and rest.
Right, and that's where caravanserais came in. Think of them like ancient truck stops, these roadside inns that were all along the Silk Road. They provided shelter, food, water, and even a place for merchants to trade their goods.
So they weren't just a place to rest, but also a hub for commerce and sharing information. Sounds like the social media of its time.
Exactly. Caravanserais were essential for how the Silk Road worked. They gave travelers a much-needed break, they created a sense of community, and they made it easier for people to share news and information.
These long journeys must have made communication pretty important. Did the Silk Road lead to any new ways for people to stay connected across those distances?
Well, it didn't directly lead to inventions like the telephone, but it did help spread existing communication technologies, things like paper and printing, which made it easier to create and share written messages, maps, even official documents.
It's like an early version of a postal service,
Yeah.
helping spread information across continents.
Yeah.
And I bet languages changed too, with so many different cultures interacting.
Yeah, absolutely. The Silk Road brought people speaking tons of different languages into close contact, which led to new trade languages developing and influenced the languages that already existed.
So it wasn't just goods and technologies being traded, but languages and ideas too. It sounds like the Silk Road was a catalyst for a truly global exchange. And speaking of global exchange, we've talked about Buddhism, but were other religions affected by the Silk Road?
Oh, for sure. It wasn't just Buddhism. The Silk Road was like a crossroads for a bunch of different religions. Christianity, Islam, even Zoroastrianism, they all spread and interacted along those routes.
It must have been an incredibly diverse religious landscape. Buddhist monks, Christian missionaries, Islamic scholars, all traveling and sharing their beliefs. I imagine there were some really fascinating encounters, and probably some tense ones too.
You're right, there were definitely conflicts and clashes between different belief systems. But the Silk Road also made it possible for a lot of exchange and mutual influence between these religions.
It's like this giant laboratory of faith, with different beliefs being tested and changed as they encountered each other. Did this exchange lead to any lasting changes within these religions?
Definitely. Look at how Mahayana Buddhism evolved. Its development was influenced by the Silk Road. And its exposure to all these other beliefs as it spread east.
So the Silk Road wasn't just a trade route. It was a catalyst for religious change, too. It's amazing to think about the ripple effects it had on history. But beyond these grand narratives of trade and religion, I'm curious about the people who actually lived and worked along the Silk Road. What was life like for them?
Okay, imagine living in a busy Silk Road city like Samarkand or Kashgar. Every day you'd be running into travelers and traders from all over the known world. Just imagine the stories they had.
It must have been like living in a constant state of cultural immersion. What were those cities like? Were they just giant marketplaces?
They were these vibrant centers of commerce, culture, and innovation. Think impressive architecture, bustling marketplaces overflowing with exotic goods, centers of learning where scholars from different cultures exchanged ideas.
Wow, sounds like they had it all. But did everyone benefit from the Silk Road trade? Or was it mostly the merchants and the elites who prospered?
While the Silk Road did bring a lot of wealth and prosperity to many, it definitely wasn't without its downsides. The influx of all these foreign goods and ideas sometimes disrupted local economies and traditions.
Sounds like a double-edged sword,
Yeah,
bringing opportunities and challenges at the same time.
exactly. And we can't forget about the dangers. Bandits, disease, unpredictable weather. These were constant threats for people who relied on the Silk Road.
It sounds like life on the Silk Road was a really complex mix. Adventure, opportunity, and hardship. But I'm guessing it was never boring. We've talked about so much: trade networks, bustling cities, the risks these travelers faced. But I'm curious about your perspective on the bigger picture. What do you think is the most enduring legacy of the Silk Road?
That's a really interesting question. For me, I think the most important thing the Silk Road reminds us of is that our world has always been interconnected. Long before anyone ever said the word globalization, people were exchanging goods, ideas, and cultures across vast distances. It's like this thread running through history, connecting us to our past and reminding us of our shared human experience.
And as we deal with the complexities of our modern world, I imagine there are a lot of valuable lessons we can learn from this ancient network.
Absolutely. The Silk Road shows us that cooperation and exchange can lead to incredible innovation and cultural richness, but it also shows us how important it is to understand and try to reduce the risks that come with being interconnected.
It's a powerful message, especially for today. It seems like the Silk Road has a lot to teach us about both embracing the benefits of global cooperation and being aware of the potential challenges.
Exactly. And as we continue to deal with things like trade, migration, and cultural exchange, the Silk Road can serve as a source of both inspiration and cautionary tales.
It's been an amazing journey, exploring the Silk Road, from its markets to its impact on religion and technology.
And there's still so much more to explore.
You're right. We'll finish up our exploration of the Silk Road and leave you with some final thoughts to think about when we come back after a short break. Welcome back for the final stretch of our Silk Road deep dive.
We've wandered through those bustling markets, followed ancient caravans, and even felt those echoes of cultural exchange.
It's amazing, how something from centuries ago can still feel so relevant today.
Yeah, that's history for you, right? It gives us this way to understand the present. And even, imagine the future.
And speaking of the future, we talked about China's Belt and Road Initiative earlier. But are there, other parallels between the ancient Silk Road and today's interconnected world? I mean, beyond the geopolitical stuff.
There are some interesting similarities. Have you heard of the concept of a digital Silk Road?
A digital Silk Road? What's that?
Well, it's not about roads and sea routes this time. It's about data and information flowing across the internet.
So instead of silk and spices, we're trading bits and bytes.
Yeah.
Like a modern digital version of those old trade routes.
Exactly. And just like the ancient Silk Road, this digital network is creating all these new opportunities for trade, communication, and cultural exchange.
But I'm guessing it's not without its downsides, right? What about cybersecurity threats, or misinformation, or the digital divide between people who have access and those who don't?
You got it. It's almost like history repeating itself, but with this digital spin, we're seeing those same patterns from the Silk Road. Interconnectedness, innovation, risk.
Makes you think.
Yeah.
Even though technology changes, those underlying human dynamics, they stay the same.
Yeah, they're complex, for sure. Our world today, it's a lot like the world of the Silk Road. This mix of competing interests, cultural differences, and that constant push and pull between cooperation and conflict.
It's like we're all trying to solve this giant interconnected puzzle, and each piece is a different culture, nation, ideology. Finding the right fit isn't easy.
That's a great way to put it. And like any puzzle, there's no one right answer. It takes patience, understanding, and being willing to see things from different perspectives.
Which brings us back to the heart of the Silk Road, right, and its legacy of cultural exchange. Feels like there's a lesson there for us today.
Definitely. The Silk Road shows us that encountering different cultures, even though it can be challenging sometimes, can also be really enriching. It exposes us to new ideas, different ways of life, and that makes us more adaptable, more resilient.
It's like that old saying, travel broadens the mind. But with the Silk Road, it wasn't just about physical travel. It was about ideas, beliefs, art.
And that journey is still going on. Think about the fusion of different cuisines, the way music styles blend together, the mixing of art styles. These are all echoes of that cultural exchange from the Silk Road.
It's like the spirit of the Silk Road is still alive, inspiring us to embrace diversity, connect with others, and just keep exploring this amazing, ever-changing tapestry of human culture.
And that exploration is so important. The Silk Road teaches us that the more we learn about other cultures, the more we understand ourselves and our place in the world.
It's been an amazing journey, exploring the Silk Road, from its markets to its influence on religion and technology. But before we wrap things up, I want to bring it back to our listeners. Why should they care about the Silk Road today? What makes it relevant to their lives?
The Silk Road reminds us that globalization isn't new. It's a story that's been unfolding for centuries, shaping the world we live in right now. By understanding the past, we can better navigate the present, and maybe even influence the future.
So to our listeners, keep exploring. Check out the UNESCO Silk Road website, read some historical accounts. You could even plan a trip to one of these fascinating cities.
You might discover a personal connection to this ancient network, one that goes back thousands of years.
Wow, that's an incredible thought. The Silk Road is more than just history. It's a story that's still being written, and we're all a part of it.
As we finish up this deep dive, I'd like to leave you with one last thought. What will be the legacy of our own modern Silk Roads? How will the digital networks and global connections of our time shape humanity's future?
That's a really powerful question. Maybe one day, years from now, another deep dive will explore the echoes of our era, tracing the threads of connection and change that define the 21st century. But for now, we'll let you continue your own explorations. Thanks for joining us on this incredible journey.
It's been my pleasure. Until next time.
Keep diving deep, everyone.